Hello students, welcome on board. This is part 3 of the chapter Sexual Reproduction in Flowering Plants. The topics covered in the video are pollination, different types of pollination, abiotic agents of pollination, and biotic agents of pollination. For better understanding, please watch part 1 and part 2 before watching the video. Without further ado, let's begin with the first topic. Now we know that in flowering plants, pollen grain is the male gamete. Pollen grain is the male gamete, and embryo sac is the female gamete, right? Now both the gametes are non-motile in nature. They are non-motile. So how will the fertilization take place? It is achieved by a mechanism called pollination. Now in this video, we'll discuss in detail what is pollination and the different types of pollination. Now let's first see what is pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains. It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a pistil. Alright, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a pistil. Now, based on the source of pollen, there are 3 types of pollination, and these are autogamy, geitonogamy, and xenogamy. The 3 types of pollination are autogamy, geitonogamy, and xenogamy. Now we'll first see what is autogamy. All right. In autogamy, the pollination is achieved within the same flower. In autogamy, the pollination is achieved within the same flower. That means the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. Now, autogamy is a rare type of pollination. This is because the pollen release and stigma receptivity should be synchronized, and also the anther and stigma should lie close to each other for the self-pollination to take place. Alright, so autogamy is rare because the pollen release and stigma receptivity should be synchronized, and also the anther and stigma should lie close to each other for the self-pollination to take place. Now in some plants like viola, commelina, and oxalis, there are 2 types of flowers. And these are chasmogamous flowers and clistogamous flowers. Now let us first see what are chasmogamous flowers. Now these are flowers which are similar to the flowers of other species. Now in this figure, you can see that the flower is open. That means the flower is with exposed anther and stigma, right? Now because it has exposed anther and stigma, it can undergo both self-pollination and cross-pollination. So chasmogamous flower is an open flower with well-exposed anther and stigma, and it can undergo both self-pollination and cross-pollination, right? Now let us learn about clistogamous flowers. Clistogamous flowers. Now as you can see here, the clistogamous flower is a closed flower, and these flowers do not open at all. The anther and the stigma lie close to each other, so only self-pollination takes place in clistogamous flower. Alright, so clistogamous flowers are closed flowers and they do not open at all. The anther and stigma lie close to each other, and therefore only self-pollination takes place in these flowers. Alright. Now to memorize that clistogamous flowers are closed, just remember that both words starts with the letters C and L. Alright. So clistogamous flowers are closed, whereas chasmogamous flowers are open. Now we'll learn the second type of pollination, which is geitonogamy. So geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grains. It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Alright, so geitonogamy is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. Now functionally, it involves cross-pollination. Because the pollen grain is transferred from one flower to another. But genetically, it is similar to autogamy because the pollen grain is from the same plant, right? So geitonogamy functionally involves cross-pollination, but genetically it is similar to autogamy because the pollen grain comes from the same plant. Basically, it is self-pollen. Alright. Now the third type of pollination is xenogamy. It is also known as cross-pollination. Now in xenogamy, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. Alright, in xenogamy, the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. So the plant receives pollen grains which are genetically different. They receive pollen grains which are genetically different. Alright. Now let's recap the three types of pollination. The first one is autogamy, which is self-pollination. In this, the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. The second one is geitonogamy, which is also self-pollination. In this, the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of another flower of the same plant. And the third one is xenogamy or cross-pollination. In this, the pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. Alright. Now let's learn about agents of pollination. Agents of pollination. Now, plants use abiotic agents and biotic agents for pollination. They use abiotic agents and biotic agents for pollination. The abiotic agents include wind and water. And biotic agents include insects, birds, and animals. Okay? Now, in the case of abiotic agents, only few plants use abiotic agents for pollination. This is because it reduces the chance of pollen grains. It reduces the chance of pollen grains to come in contact with the stigma. All right. Now, in order to meet this uncertainty or loss of pollen grains, the flowers produce large amount of pollen compared to ovules available for the pollination. Now, let's see the pollination by abiotic agents. Let's first begin with wind pollination. Wind pollination is the most common type of abiotic pollination. The wind-pollinated flowers will have some common features, and let's see what are they. First, the stamen of wind-pollinated flowers will be well exposed. In the figure, you can see that the stamen is well exposed. Their pollen grains are light and non-sticky. Their pollen grains are light and non-sticky so that they can be easily transported by the wind currents. The stigma is large and feathery so that the stigma can trap the airborne pollen grains. All right. They have a single ovule. in the ovary, and also numerous flowers are packed into an inflorescence. All right. Now, example of plants with wind-pollinated flowers include grasses, maize, date palm, etc. So, the wind-pollinated flowers will have well-exposed stamen. Their pollen grains are light and non-sticky so that they can be easily transported by the wind currents. The stigma is large and feathery to trap the airborne pollen grains. They have a single ovule and numerous flowers are packed into an inflorescence. The examples are grasses, maize, date palm, etc. Now let's learn about water pollination. Water pollination is a rare type of pollination because not all aquatic plants depend on water for pollination. Like in the case of water hyacinth and water lily, though they are aquatic plants, they depend on insects or wind for pollination. Now, if you look at the picture, you'll see that their flowers emerge above the water level and they depend on insects or wind for pollination. All right. Now, let's see an example of an aquatic plant called Vallisneria. Vallisneria is an aquatic plant that uses water for pollination. If you look at the picture, you can see that the female flower reaches the water surface by a long stalk and the pollen grains are released on the surface of water. And these pollen grains are carried to the stigma by passive water currents. Alright. So the female flowers reach the water surface by a long stalk, and the pollen grains are released on the water surface, and these pollen grains are carried to the stigma. By passive water currents. Alright. Now there's also another example of an aquatic plant, which is seagrass. Now seagrass uses water for pollination. And if you look at the picture, you'll see that the female flowers are submerged within the water, and their pollen grains are also released into the water. So the female flowers are submerged in the water, their pollen grains are released inside the water, and their pollen grains are long and ribbon-like. And these pollen grains are carried passively by water current. They are carried passively by water current. Alright. Now, in most of the water pollinated plants, the pollen grains will be protected by a mucilaginous covering. Alright. So now we've learned about wind and water pollinated plants, right? So the flowers of these plants have one thing in common, and that is the flowers of these plants are not colorful. They are not colorful, and they do not produce nectar. Okay? So we've learned about the abiotic agents, right? Now we're going to learn about the biotic agents. Biotic agents of pollination. So biotic agents include insects, birds, and some animals. Now insects include bees, butterflies, moths, ants, etc. Now bees are the most dominant biotic pollinating agent. These are the dominant biotic pollinating agent. Alright. Now in case of birds, sunbirds and hummingbirds act as pollinators. And in case of animals, rodents and some reptiles act as pollinators in some species. Okay. Now we are going to learn the characteristics of insect-pollinated flowers. Insect-pollinated flowers. Insect-pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar. Insect pollinated flowers are large, colorful, fragrant, and rich in nectar, as you can see in this picture. Now, if the flowers are small, then the flowers are clustered to form inflorescence in order to make them visible to their pollinators. All right. Now, some flowers which are pollinated by beetles and flies secrete foul odor in order to attract them. While there are some other flowers which provide rewards like nectar and pollen, and this is to sustain the animal visits. So when a pollinator is harvesting the reward, it comes in contact with the anther. So its body gets covered with pollen grains, and when it comes in contact with the stigma, it brings about pollination. All right. Now, other than pollen and nectar, there are some plants which provide safe places to their pollinators to lay their eggs. Examples of these plants are Amorphophallus and Yucca. Now, in the case of Yucca, it provides a safe place to a moth to lay its eggs, and in return, the plant gets pollinated. All right. So that's it for the session. This was part 3, where we've learned about pollination, different kinds of pollination, abiotic agents of pollination, and biotic agents of pollination. In part 4, we will be covering outbreeding devices, pollen-pistil interaction, and double fertilization. If you found this helpful, please do like the video, and if you have any doubts, comment down below. Subscribe to watch the upcoming videos. Thank you for watching.